Hey, you. Yes, you, person watching my video. Are you in games on a regular basis and finding out that your CPU rating is too low? Is your wife, girlfriend, or significant other threatening to leave you because of your weak little CPU, unable to perform in games like Settings or games like Hilly Plateau? Do you find yourself dropping to -1 sim speed 10 minutes into a game and you have no idea why? Then look no further. You found the Duelist's ultimate guide for improving performance in FAF. Yeah! Explosions! Boom! Alright guys, that was a really fun intro to do. This is going to be a fairly technical video, but I'll try and explain things in a way that I would understand it if I knew nothing, and I'm an idiot, so if I can get it, then you guys can easily get it. Now I'm going to drop a couple of disclaimers here. First off, I am not an expert in CPUs or RAM or their designs or anything like that. I'm not an electrical engineer. I know that there are a couple of engineers out there. And for those of you guys that are about to type in the comments saying your definitions are overly simplistic, yes, you are right. I am well aware of that. But I believe that the definitions I have for the purposes of this video are great. Secondly, what I'm about to show you can potentially damage your components. Now, before you start freaking out, a lot of modern hardware is very, very good at protecting itself and is mostly idiot proof. Hence me doing this video. Like I said, I'm an idiot, and if I can do it, then you guys can do it. But I am going to grab this and drop this here and say, if you follow this guide, you do so at your own risk. And if you damage any of your components, then I'm not going to be held responsible. So let's get into it. Excitement, boom, explosions, etc. Okay, let's set the stage. Now there are a few terms that I want to define before we continue because we're going to be using them quite a bit throughout the video. First off is CPU. This is the brain of your computer. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit. Most of you guys should understand that, but it handles calculations surrounding variables. And one example in FAF is how much mass is a MEX extracting. That's just one super basic variable that the CPU is responsible for calculating and adding to your mass pool, which is a different variable stored somewhere else, etc. Now, a thread. A thread is a string of instructions. Many CPUs have two threads running on a single physical core. So much like the same way that you have two arms connected to your body and one hand can be doing one thing while another hand is doing another thing, the CPU physical core has two threads that can be doing separate things, which is why you see modern CPU advertisements saying something like 4 cores, 8 threads, 16, 12, or 6 cores, 12 threads, 8, 16, and so on and so forth, up until you get to like Threadripper, which is insane. I think it's like 32 cores, 64 threads. RAM, quick memory that can answer questions that your processor needs to ask. So this is where a lot of your variables within the game are stored. So if a processor says, hey, I need to know what the current mass value is for player number 7, which would be the Duelist or something like that, then it's going to pull the RAM real quick, grab the variable, manipulate it, etc. It's very, very quick. Now, XMP/DOCP is a profile that applied that forces your RAM to run at its advertised speeds. Now, what this means is that the speed that your RAM is running is pretty much, what am I looking for? Unified. It means how fast your RAM can answer a question. Wow, brain fart. So if your CPU asks a question and your RAM is running at one speed versus, a higher speed, it's going to answer the question slower. This can cause a bottleneck. Now, if this isn't enabled, then the shiny 16 gigabyte, 3200 megahertz DDR4 kit that you installed will not be running at 3200 megahertz. It will run at 2133 megahertz, so it will run slower. At 2133, it will answer questions slower than it will at 3200. I'm not going to be touching RAM timings for this video. I know that cast latency and things like that are things that do impact this, but we're going to keep this a little bit more simple for the average everyday Forge Alliance Forever user. So now, let's talk about what limits your CPU rating in Forge Alliance Forever. Now, your CPU rating, whenever you load into a lobby and you benchmark your CPU, how it has been explained to me is that this throws a complex calculation at your device and measures how fast it can perform that calculation. This is both impacted by how fast your CPU can run, which is measured in gigahertz, and how fast your RAM can answer the questions being asked by the CPU, measured in megahertz. Supreme Commander Forged Alliance Forever is largely a single-threaded application. Some calculations do get thrown onto a separate thread, but it is largely run on one thread. So remember our analogy of threads, where a core is like a person and threads are your arms. Whenever you're running Supreme Commander Forged Alliance, you imagine a right-handed person. You're going to be doing most things with your right hand, but your left hand can do a couple of other things as well in tangent with your right hand. So that's what we're going to be working with. Today, we're going to be running a series of tests with various overclocks, and the device that I'm going to be using for my testing is the same device that has powered my channel for the last year and a half or so. Core components are as follows: an i7 4790K Devil's Canyon, a kit of 32 gigabytes of DDR3, and a 980 Ti that was later upgraded to a 2080, but the 980 Ti is more than capable of running Forged Alliance forever at max settings with plenty of headroom. We're not going to be messing a whole lot with the GPU, but I know that people wanted to know kind of what my core setting or what my core components were within my system. So let's get into the actual overclocking results and how much performance you can actually get out of overclocking your device. Now, like I said earlier, we're not going to be overclocking the graphics card today. This is going to be targeted pretty much entirely at Forged Alliance forever, and the GPU is rarely your limiting resource. If you play other games, overclocking your GPU can give you a tangible improvement, but modern games do use more threads. So remember, more things can be calculated by the CPU at the same time. Forged Alliance forever, because of the way it is written, you've only got 2 hands that you can work with, even though your CPU might have 8 different threads available to it, which is what happened in the case of the Devil's Canyon CPU that we're looking at today. So we're going to be focused primarily on getting the most performance that we can out of our CPU and our RAM, because that is what is going to give us the best results within Supreme Commander Forged Alliance as it pertains to our testing. We're going to be running 4 primary tests. I have picked a Settings replay. It's a mid to high level Settings game. I think there's one 2100 level player in there, but most people are between 11 and I think it's 1500. And I'm calculating how fast my CPU can run through the simulation with each different configuration that is set. So the first one is going to be everything at bone stock. So everything as advertised on the site that I bought these original components from a long time ago. So the first one, CPU is going to be clocked at 4 gigahertz, which is an all-core clock. This is the stock base clock that the i7 4790K comes with. My RAM is going to be at 1333 megahertz, which is the stock DDR3 speed. DDR3 was a little bit weird, but this is the stock DDR3 speed that shipped with this kit. And the results of that are that at total stock, it takes the setup 23 minutes and 15 seconds to run the replay, which isn't bad. The replay was, I think, 42 minutes long, and it was relatively high level. There was a lot of air fights, etc. Next, let's apply a CPU overclock, but leave the RAM alone. So the CPU is running in this scenario at 4.6 gigahertz, which is the max stable all-core overclock that I could get out of my chip. We'll talk more about that later. Next is going to be RAM running at 1333 megahertz, which is the stock speed. And the results are a modest gain, resulting in an average of 21 minutes and 46 seconds for the replay to run. So we shaved about 1.5 minutes off of the overall sim speed. Third test is we're going to apply XMP/DOCP, and we're going to leave the CPU at stock. So the CPU is at 4 gigahertz once again. And this time we're applying the profile that forces my RAM to run at its advertised speed. So whenever I bought the kit, it was a 2400 megahertz kit. This makes the RAM run at 2400 megahertz, which means it can answer questions faster. And the results are actually a huge gain, with the rig only taking 18 minutes and 51 seconds on average to complete the replay. So that is roughly 3.5 minutes improvement. Lastly, we'll combine the two. So CPU running at 4.6 gigahertz all core, RAM at 2400 megahertz, and the device takes about 16 minutes and 37 seconds to run the replay. This is an improvement. So if we compare the first and the last test with stock versus everything overclocked, it means that we're getting an improvement of about 30% just by changing a couple of things within the BIOS and a couple of very, very easy changes just by pushing the hardware a little bit. I was super surprised that XMP had as large of an effect as it did, with most of our gains coming from applying the XMP profile and not the CPU overclock. but this makes sense. In our overly simplistic view of RAM, where it is a resource answering questions for the CPU, allowing the CPU to get an answer more quickly can lead to very tangible increases, as we've seen here. So now that we've seen that this can actually lead to some pretty tangible results in your performance in games, let's talk about how we accomplish this. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is XMP/DOCP. I'm using these terms interchangeably. XMP refers to Intel CPUs, DOCP refers to AMD CPUs, and this is the easiest one to apply. This is done in BIOS. To access your BIOS, there is a key that you'll need to press when your computer first posts. And by posts, not everybody might be familiar with that term. That just means the first time you see something on the screen whenever you power your computer on. Normally, this key is delete, but the correct key for your device will be displayed on screen. Other ones that I've seen are F2, F10, and F11. So hit that key, spam it a couple of times whenever your computer first turns on, and you'll get into BIOS. Once in the BIOS, there are a couple of places that your XMP profiles could be. Some motherboard manufacturers put it front and center on the initial screen. These people are amazing. The other people will forever remain dead to me because they bury it under a lot of very advanced tabs. But normally, if you go to an advanced tab, there will be an icon that says XMP/DOCP, and the dropdown will be set to auto. If you haven't done anything with it, you're going to want to select that dropdown and change it to either enabled or XMP as the profile that gets applied. From here, all you need to do is save the changes and reset your computer. So don't freak out if it takes about 30 seconds or so to get anything on the screen whenever you hit that reset button. Nothing has gone wrong, but your processor, which is what controls the memory in modern CPUs, the North Bridge and South Bridge have kind of been done away with, but in modern CPUs, the memory controller is on the CPU itself. And that means that whenever you hit that reset button, your processor is going to retrain the memory to run at the speed that is selected. Then whenever you load into Windows, open Task Manager, click on the Performance tab and select Memory. You should see a faster clock displayed than what happened previously. So the obvious question, what happens if this goes wrong? This is a pretty low risk process, honestly, all things considered. It's very, very difficult for you to mess this up. If something goes wrong, your processor will automatically revert to the previous auto configuration and then reboot into BIOS to allow you to remove the profile. So if you get some sort of error on your screen that says DOCP was unable to be applied or something like that, you'll be able to go back into BIOS, remove the profile, nothing will be damaged, everything is fine, just hit save changes and reset. The only thing that you'll be missing out on are the performance gains from XMP/DOCP. That being said, this is probably the biggest single thing that you can do to improve your performance in Forged Alliance Forever. And as we're walking through this, I will drop another disclaimer here that results are going to vary. These are all based on my particular specs, and there is something called silicone lottery that you guys need to understand. It's that even if you have a 4790K, you might not be able to get 4.6 gigahertz out of it. But you also might be able to get more out of it. There are people that I've seen that are able to get 5 gigahertz all core out of their 4790Ks, and that's just kind of the silicone lottery. I believe that the one I have is more on the weak side. Usually I think these things are able to boost up to 4.8, 4.9 gigahertz relatively easily. But the components that you have will limit the overclock that you get. And this is not going to be the same results for everybody, but it is definitely something that is worth giving a shot at least. Next, let's move on to the other side of the coin, which is the CPU overclock. Now, I did this one second because first off, it's more complicated, and second, it doesn't give you quite as many performance gains, but it's still about a 10% improvement on stock clocks. So we're going to talk about how to tune this correctly and how to figure out what your max overclock is on your device. Now, you're going to need a couple of tools on your computer in order to make this possible. I will link them down in the description below. If I forget, I'm sorry, yell at me in the comments. I'll go back and link them. But the first thing you're going to need is a system monitor utility. My favorite is Hardware Monitor, but if you have MSI Afterburner already installed, a lot of people do, this one works as well. The next thing you're going to need is a stress testing tool. I would recommend 3D Mark, Cinebench, or Ada64. I think 3D Mark is a paid product, but Cinebench and Ada64 are both free. I would recommend steering clear of Prime 95 just because it can cause some damage on certain components. And the internet seems to be a little bit on the fence about Prime 95. But I did use it to figure out my initial 4.6 gigahertz overclock. But I had some weird happenings go on while I was figuring out that overclock. So I would stay away from Prime 95. But if you're familiar with it, you know what you're doing, go for it. Last thing you're going to need is a high level settings game. I would recommend, just because a lot happens in settings. I'll link the one that I used as a benchmark down below. So if you guys want to compare your scores to mine, I'll link it down in the description below, so you can see if your computer renders it faster or slower than my kind of powerhouse for the channel here. And then the last thing I would say is I would not recommend doing this on a stock cooler. So a stock heatsink. Stock coolers are pretty much the bare minimum that a CPU needs to actually function, and some of them don't even allow for the full functionality of your device to actually work correctly. So I'm going to drop a picture on the screen here. If your cooler looks like this, probably need to upgrade your cooler, and that is going to be the best thing that you can do for your computer. And I will link a couple of recommendations that I have down in the comments below, or down in the description below, that are I'll set them ranging from about 30 up to maybe 100-ish if you want to go for something that is, you know, pretty heavy. But even a $30 upgrade on your CPU, as far as the cooler goes, will get you massive improvements if you're running a stock cooler that has this kind of flower look to it. There are two primary ways to go into the overclock. If you're lucky enough to have a relatively recent CPU and can use either Intel Extreme Tuning Utility or Ryzen Master to overclock, then you're going to have a little bit easier time than the rest of us who are on older chipsets and are going to have to do this through BIOS. Now, I will add here, I'm not messing with manually under/overvolting the processor here. During this process, you'll want to check your CPU voltage during the stress tests. You can see that within hardware monitor, but you'll want to make sure that it is within safe parameters for your particular CPU. Everyone is a little bit different. A good rule of thumb, though, is that if it's getting to 1.3 to 1.33 volts, it's starting to get into the danger zone, and that's where it can damage your components long term. But this is, again, unique to your processor. So whether you're doing this via BIOS or whether you're doing this via Intel XTU or Ryzen Master, the process is going to be largely the same. So you're going to find where you can set the core multiplier within the BIOS or XTU, and you're going to take that stock number. So if you're in the case of my 4790K, it would read 40X, and that means that it is running at 4 gigahertz. So if I bump it up to 41X, that means it's going to be running at 4.1 gigahertz, and so on. So now if you're in BIOS, you're going to want to make sure that you have sync all cores selected. You're also going to want to make sure that you have auto voltage selected as well. And then you're going to bump this up to 41X. If you've done that, you hit save, you reset your computer. Congratulations, you have applied your first overclock. Even a little overclock is an overclock. Within Intel XTU, you can actually just click the little apply button on the bottom left-hand side of the advanced tuning utility screen, and that will apply the overclock within Windows. So it's a little bit quicker. From here, you want to do a stress test. So we're going to fire up our Cinebench, our AIDA64, whatever you're using. I'm going to be using Cinebench on the screen here, and we're going to set it to run for about 3 to 5 minutes. If you're using a water cooler or an AIO, you're going to want to run this for longer, like ideally 15 to 30 minutes, just so that that liquid loop can become totally heat soaked and you reach equilibrium during the process. So you've run it, it passes, great. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to want to see if you can push it further. So you're going to go back to XTU or your BIOS, you're going to bump it from 41X to 42X. Then you're going to reboot into your OS or hit apply in XTU. You're going to run the stress test again, and you're going to keep repeating this until it fails. Now, whenever it fails, you're going to see it fail in one of 3 ways. The first way is potentially a crash to desktop, but you can still use your computer, you can still move the mouse around, etc. The second is a hard lock on the operating system. So this means that you get a crash, everything freezes, you can't move the mouse, and you're gonna have to hit the power button for 5 seconds to shut down. The last way, and potentially the scariest, is you're gonna get a blue screen of death, and then the computer will automatically restart. Now, it is incredibly important to understand that none of these things are things to worry about if it only happens once. If you continue ramming your head against the wall over and over again, like my 4790K is unstable at 4.7 gigahertz. If I continuously threw 4.7 gigahertz at that thing, it would damage the component over time. But if it only happens once, it's nothing to worry about. All you're going to do is revert to the previous multiplier that was stable. So if you went from 46x to 47x, all you got to do is go back to 46x, hit apply, and then you want to rerun your stress test to make sure that that is a stable all-core overclock still. Now, I've been using this term all-core overclock a lot in this, and this is just because it's the easiest way to overclock, applying the same clock to all cores across the device. Now, some of you might remember back from previously in the video that Forged Alliance Forever is a single-threaded or sort of two-threaded application. So what if we apply an overclock to just a single core instead of multiple cores? Now, I'm thinking about doing a video about that in the future, seeing if I can get some additional performance out of just overclocking one particular core. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to be doing an all-core overclock, and that'll get you a good performance upgrade. So I think at this point in the video, you should have gotten a pretty significant performance uplift in your Forged Alliance Forever experience. Go ahead and run if you want to do this for fun, go ahead and pull the replay that I have linked down in the description below, run it at stock, run it with your overclock, and see exactly how much of a performance increase you guys got. I would love to hear about it down in the comments below. If any of you guys beat my 30% performance uplift, that would be awesome. And so to wrap up, I have one final thought. This video shows that blowing all of your budget, if you're building your own computer, blowing all of the budget on your CPU and your GPU while going for a very budget RAM kit and motherboard is not the way that you should build a computer. Think of this like a car. If you drop a very powerful V8 into a car and then duct tape off half of the intake, it's not going to perform like a V8. A motherboard is very similarly, it operates in much the same way. The motherboard is what delivers power to the CPU and to a bunch of other components, but for the purposes of today, it delivers power to the CPU. If the motherboard cannot support what your CPU is demanding, your CPU is not going to function very well. You'll see a motherboard, so let's take a B450 board. A B450 motherboard has an AM4 socket in it. That means that you could put a Ryzen 9 5950X into that motherboard. But is that Ryzen 9 5950X going to run at its highest potential? No, because the B450, especially the lower B450 motherboards, cannot deliver the power and don't have enough PCI lanes for that particular CPU to really flex its muscles. So if you're going to be building a computer, it's important that you balance your components and make sure that the CPU that you're using can be utilized entirely by the motherboard, by the PCI lanes or highways for the traffic, by the power delivery system, etc. And unfortunately, a lot of OEMs will build systems for CPU and GPU specs, and they will skimp incredibly on the motherboard and the RAM kits. And this is because CPU and GPU specs sell. If you see something that has a 5900X and NVIDIA 3090 in it, 32 gigs of RAM, you're going to think that that's an amazing system. But if that's all powered by like a B450 motherboard, you're not going to get anywhere near the performance that you would out of an X570 or one of the upper level chipsets for the AM4 socket. So that's kind of my main gripe. The other big gripe I have with OEM builders, and I'm going on a tangent here, is that they use proprietary parts. Whenever I was recording on my old rig, and you guys were getting audio dropouts, I traced the reason back, and one of the reasons why audio was dropping out at particular points was because the CPU was overheating and throwing errors, and it was encoding incorrectly, and there was no way really to compensate for that outside of upgrading the cooling solution. But the problem was the CPU cooler was proprietary bullshit. There was no way that I could upgrade the CPU cooler. And so then I looked at pulling all of the parts out of the pre-built computer that I was using previously, and then putting it in a different case so that I could manage the cooling a little bit better. But the power supply was proprietary bullshit. The motherboard was proprietary bullshit. None of it was going to fit into a different case. And that meant that I was only able to pull about half of the components out of that thing. And the rest of it just becomes e-waste, which is, I mean, I'm going to get off my soapbox here. The moral of the story is that if you skimp on the motherboard and the RAM, you're going to starve your CPU as well as your graphics card. And you're going to waste budget on a high-end part that is just waiting for information from your RAM, from your hard drive or something like that. So be smart, guys. I don't know if you guys want me to do a guide on building videos. I'll link some down in the description below, or building computers. I'll link some down in the description below. There's a lot of people out there that are much smarter than me on this particular topic, but I wanted to do one specific to Forge Alliance Forever. Yeah, that's it for today. Longer video, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys got some use out of it. Let me know what your results now are down in the comments below. And be safe whenever you're doing this. Don't be stupid. Clicking buttons and just dragging sliders to maximum is a great way to break your components. So don't do that. Follow this guide. All right, that's it for me, guys. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.